I sat in silence, the old hearing aid in my hand, as my son Tom and his wife Karen laughed at me. They thought it was harmless, mocking me, selling my hearing aid online as a joke. But they didn't realize that behind my quiet facade, I was listening. Every word, every betrayal. And when the bank froze their accounts, I watched their world crumble, all while I waited to show them that family bonds can break just as easily as they can be betrayed. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Margaret Ellis sat at the worn wooden table, a cup of tea resting before her fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. Her mind, however, was far from the warmth of the porcelain cup. The dull clink of keys from the living room, the unmistakable sound of her son Tom and his wife, Karen, laughing, pierced the quiet. "Look at this, Karen!" Tom's voice was mocking, too loud for the setting. "Mom's old hearing aid. We can sell it as a vintage item. Some idiot will pay for it." Karen's laughter rang through the thin walls, sharp and biting. "I'll post it on eBay. Perfect joke. Maybe we'll make a few bucks," she added, her voice dripping with mockery. Margaret's chest tightened, but her expression remained neutral. She didn't respond, didn't even flinch. Instead, her fingers tightened around the handle of her cup, and she lifted it to her lips, sipping slowly. She had heard every word. In the other room, Tom's laughter echoed, and Karen's voice followed, cutting through the air like a blade. "Can you believe she still uses this thing? It's like she's a relic of some bygone era." A jagged heat blossomed in Margaret's stomach, but she kept her gaze on the cup. Her lips pressed into a tight line. She pretended not to hear them. Lily, her granddaughter, stood in the doorway, her phone held up as she watched the scene unfold. Horror painted across her face, her fingers gripping the device as though it were a lifeline. She swallowed hard, her heart sinking. Her grandmother, the woman who had been the pillar of their family, was being mocked, and there was nothing she could do. Margaret, for her part, remained unmoved. The rage that simmered beneath her skin stayed hidden, tucked away behind the calm facade she had spent a lifetime perfecting. She set the cup down slowly, its delicate clink against the table a quiet protest to the cruelty she was enduring. Lily took a step forward, the phone still recording. "Grandma, they—" Margaret's eyes flicked to her. A single unspoken word passed between them. "Later." Lily held her ground, but the weight of what she was witnessing seemed to collapse on her chest. Margaret's silence, her willingness to let it slide, both scared and reassured her. She knew this was not weakness. No, her grandmother was planning something far more terrifying than any outburst could be. Margaret turned away from the table and rose to her feet. Her movements were deliberate, calculated. She walked with quiet determination toward the small, forgotten safe tucked in the corner of the room. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she turned the dial of the lock. A soft, metallic click echoed as the door opened, revealing old folders, their edges worn from years of careful handling. Ruth's voice, low and conspiratorial, cut through the stillness from the open window. "Don't shout, Margaret. Plot." Margaret did not respond. She did not need to. Ruth knew her well, knew that the silence was her weapon, a weapon honed over decades of submission, a weapon that now would be turned against those who thought they had outsmarted her. As she pulled out one of the folders, the faintest of smiles tugged at the corner of her lips. She ran her hand over the papers inside. They weren't just documents. They were her plans. Her carefully constructed plans that would transform this cruelty into something far more devastating. The folder was full of financial statements, old bank documents, and contracts that tied her directly to every cent Tom and Karen had ever taken from her. It was a carefully built fortress of paperwork, a fortress that now, more than ever, would serve as her shield. She turned, her expression unreadable, and walked back to the kitchen. Lily watched her, still holding the phone, her chest tight with anticipation. She knew what was coming. Margaret met her eyes for a moment, and though she said nothing, the weight of her gaze spoke volumes. This was far from over. From the other room, Tom's voice grew louder. What a loser! Who even needs a hearing aid anymore? It's not like she could hear us. Margaret did not flinch. She did not rise to the bait. Instead, she sat back down at the table, the folder still in her hands. The pieces were falling into place, methodical, relentless. Her hands, though aging, were steady as she began to make notes, her pen dancing across the paper. Every stroke, every line, every figure on the page was a deliberate choice, a step toward the vengeance she would bring. Margaret did not need to hear Tom and Karen's mocking voices anymore. She already knew what was coming next, and it would be far worse than anything they could imagine. The morning light filtered softly through the kitchen window, casting long shadows on the worn floorboards. Margaret sat alone at the table, the envelope before her, a stark contrast to the calm that filled the room. The envelope was thin but heavy, its contents more powerful than any object it could contain. Inside were the papers she had retrieved the night before, documents that tied her irrevocably to every financial decision, every dollar spent, every cent stolen by Tom and Karen. Margaret ran her fingers over the paper's edges, feeling the weight of what it represented. The calm exterior she wore in public was gone now. What remained was a quiet, determined woman who had once tolerated the cruelties of her family, but no more. She looked at the clock. It was time. Her hand hovered over the envelope for a moment, steady despite the storm inside her. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and before she could even think to turn, the door creaked open. Mr. Harper, her longtime attorney, entered with his usual calm demeanor. His age had done little to dull the sharpness of his eyes or the precision of his speech. He was a man who spoke little but said everything when he did. "You've been thinking about this," he said, his voice low but firm as he sat across from her. He didn't need to ask. He could see it in her eyes. It was the quiet before the storm, the heavy stillness of a woman who had made a decision. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She pushed the envelope across the table, her fingers still pressing lightly on it, as if giving it weight, a presence of its own. Mr. Harper opened the envelope slowly, his eyes flicking over the papers with practiced ease. He nodded slightly as he read through them. "You're still the primary authority on these accounts. It's all in your favor, Margaret." She nodded, her face unreadable, her posture poised. Everything was falling into place. They had underestimated her. They had mocked her. And now it was her turn to decide their fate. From the hallway, the sound of laughter broke the silence. It was Tom, his voice grating against the air. "Oh, look at this. Karen, another pair of luxury bags. Because, we deserve it." Margaret's eyes didn't shift from the envelope, but the corners of her mouth tightened slightly. Tom and Karen's laughter rang in her ears, a cruel reminder of the world they were building at her expense. Mr. Harper's eyes lifted from the papers, his gaze sharp. "They don't know what's coming," he murmured. The sound of heels clicking against the hardwood floor grew louder, and then Karen appeared in the doorway. Her smile was as plastic as the bag she carried, her arms piled high with new acquisitions. "Margaret," Karen said with an exaggerated sweetness, "I just bought these new bags, the kind that makes a statement, you know. I'll send you a picture later so you can see what real luxury looks like." Margaret met her gaze, her face still as a mask. But Karen's words stung, each one landing like a slap. "You'll need more than a few bags, Karen," Margaret thought silently, but she remained calm. She knew the perfect way to show them what true power felt like. Lily entered the room just then, her expression a mix of concern and empathy. She walked over to her grandmother and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. The touch was warm, grounding, like an anchor in the rising tide. "Are you okay, Grandma?" Margaret looked up at her granddaughter, offering a soft, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm fine, Lily. Just getting started." Ruth's voice, always laced with wit, drifted in from the open window. "They sold your hearing, Margaret. You'll sell their comfort? Margaret looked down at the envelope again, the words of her neighbor echoing in her mind. Comfort. That's exactly what they would lose. Their luxury, their easy lives, their sense of entitlement. All of it would slip away like sand through their fingers. With a slow, deliberate motion, Margaret picked up the pen. The tip hovered above the papers for just a moment, as though the weight of the decision was almost too much to bear. But only for a moment. The pen dipped to the paper, its sharp stroke marking the first of many moves in a game she had already won. Her signature was neat, precise, and final. Mr. Harper looked up as she signed, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of respect and approval. Are you sure about this, Margaret? Margaret didn't answer right away. She simply placed the pen down with finality, her hand still resting on the papers. Yes, she said softly. It's time. The room grew quieter, the air thick with the weight of her words. The power had shifted, and in that moment she could feel it. Margaret was no longer the woman they had mocked. She was the architect of their downfall. From the next room, Tom's voice floated through again, this time tinged with frustration. What's going on with the accounts? Why are we getting all these notifications? Margaret's lips curled into a smile, barely perceptible but full of promise. She had signed the first of many instructions to freeze their accounts, every financial avenue that they had used to fund their excesses. The game had officially begun. The morning had taken on an oppressive weight, the kind of quiet that only deep tension can bring. The sun sat high in the sky, but inside Margaret's house, shadows stretched long across the rooms. Her son, Tom, and his wife Karen had just returned from the bank, and their faces were the kind of red you get when you've just had your ego shattered in public. Karen was the first to speak, though the words caught in her throat. She entered the kitchen, her heels clicking on the tile like the harsh notes of a song that had gone flat. Her usual sleek, composed look was replaced by something much more frantic, her hair slightly out of place, her lips pressed together in a line that told of mounting frustration. What's going on, Margaret? Karen's voice was tight, strained with the effort of maintaining composure. I went to the bank to transfer funds and they said they couldn't access the account. Margaret didn't look up from the cup of tea she was slowly sipping, her fingers wrapped around the porcelain handle like a life raft. The calmness in her expression was a stark contrast to the panic that clouded Karen's face. Margaret's gaze remained fixed on the window, watching the branches of the old oak tree sway in the breeze outside. She could hear the low hum of the refrigerator, a constant reminder of the stillness that filled the house. Did you hear me? Karen asked, her voice edging toward hysteria. Margaret's lips parted just enough to offer the barest of responses. I heard you. From behind her, Lily entered the room. She didn't speak, but there was a quiet reassurance in her presence. Her eyes met Margaret's for a brief moment, as if exchanging some unspoken understanding. Margaret's calmness steadied her granddaughter too. They had talked about this, about waiting for the right moment to let the inevitable unfold. Tom stormed into the kitchen, his face a mask of fury. His usual cocky attitude had been stripped away, replaced with an ugly rawness that exposed just how deeply unsettled he was by what was happening. Mom, what the hell did you do? His voice was low, but there was a venom in it that made Lily flinch. We tried to access the joint accounts and nothing's there. What the hell is going on? He slammed a fist against the counter, the sound sharp, loud. Margaret set her cup down on the table with the kind of deliberation that only someone who had spent years cultivating patience could manage. She met Tom's gaze, her expression unreadable before she spoke. You've already seen it, haven't you? Seen what? Tom barked, his frustration pushing him forward, but the venom in his tone was laced with growing uncertainty. The freeze order, Margaret said softly. It's active now. Everything you thought was safe is frozen. Lily stood back, her arms folded across her chest, watching as the reality of their situation sank in. Karen's face had gone pale, the color draining from her as she turned to Tom for an explanation. But Tom was speechless now, staring at his mother with a look that was half disbelief, half fury. "How could you do this?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You have no right." Margaret didn't react to the words. Her eyes were steady, unfazed. She simply leaned back in her chair, a slight smirk curling at the edge of her lips. She was calm, too calm. The power, once thought to be theirs, was now in her hands. Tom's breathing became shallow, his eyes darting from the bank statements to Karen, to Lily, and back to Margaret. You think this is some kind of game? You think you can just take everything away from us?" His anger was palpable, each word coming out in a burst of heat, but Margaret didn't flinch. "No," she said simply. "I think you've already taken everything from me, and now it's my turn." The front door opened with a creak, and Ruth's voice floated into the room. "Well, well," she said with a chuckle, stepping inside, her eyes lighting up with the kind of mischief that only a neighbor who had seen too much could possess. "Looks like someone's had their playtime." Karen turned toward Ruth, her expression a blend of confusion and rage. "What's so funny, Ruth?" she spat. Ruth's lips curled into a sly grin as she leaned against the doorframe, watching the unfolding drama with an air of amusement. "Plastic silence, Karen," she muttered, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "You thought you could buy your way out of anything. Well, looks like someone's been listening. Finally." Lily's eyes darted to Margaret, who had not moved since Tom's outburst. Margaret's fingers were now steepled in front of her, as if in quiet contemplation, but there was a glint in her eyes that told Lily exactly what was happening. It wasn't just the bank accounts that were frozen. Everything that Tom and Karen had built, everything they took for granted, was coming undone. Margaret finally stood up, her movements deliberate, the decision already made. She looked at Tom and Karen, their faces flushed with panic, before she turned back to the window. She could hear them now, their voices rising in desperation behind her. But it was too late. The seeds had been sown. A soft chuckle escaped her lips, and she didn't even try to hide it. "You'll never learn, will you?" she said quietly. "I've been listening to you for years, but now, it's my turn." Tom was a storm unleashed. He raged in the driveway, slamming his fists against the sides of the broken ATM as if it were the root of all his problems. Each strike reverberated through the empty parking lot, the harsh clang of metal against metal a fitting soundtrack to his fury. "Come on!" he shouted as if the machine could hear him. "What the hell is going on with this stupid thing?" His voice cracked with frustration, growing louder, sharper with each futile punch. The ATM screen flickered weakly before resetting to a blank, indifferent display, mocking his efforts. Behind him, Karen stood with her arms crossed, her posture tense. She glanced nervously at the surrounding area, avoiding the gazes of onlookers who had gathered from nearby stores, whispering behind their hands. The public spectacle of Tom's meltdown had drawn the attention he loathed, but it didn't seem to faze him. His world had been upended, and all he could do was lash out, helpless against the invisible force that had reduced him to this. Margaret, on the other hand, was calm, eerily calm. She sat at her kitchen table, feeding the birds outside her window. The quiet flutter of wings, the soft chirp of sparrows hopping along the ledge, seemed like a symphony in contrast to the chaos her son was creating miles away. She had seen this coming. She had known exactly how Tom would react. And now, it was almost amusing. Lily entered the kitchen quietly, holding her phone in her hand, her expression a mix of empathy and amusement. "Grandma," she said, offering the phone. On the screen, Tom's face was red with anger, his hands gripping the ATM's metal frame as if he could force the machine to comply. The video caught every detail: his frustration, his futile attempts, the way he paced back and forth in a circle, helpless and enraged. Margaret looked at the screen but didn't smile. She simply watched. Lily, however, couldn't suppress a small chuckle, and Margaret's lips curled into a brief, knowing smile. "You're enjoying this a bit, aren't you?" Margaret remarked softly, her eyes still on the video. Lily shrugged, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. It's just hard to watch him unravel like this. But at the same time, it feels deserved. Margaret placed the last bit of birdseed into the feeder, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions swirling around her family. Sometimes, Lily, people don't learn until everything they've built crumbles. Lily didn't respond. She knew her grandmother's silence held far more weight than any words could. Margaret didn't need to say more. She never did. Meanwhile, at the bank, the scene only grew worse. Tom's frustration had reached a boiling point. He had been to every ATM in the area, each one rejecting his card with the same cold, indifferent message, unable to process transaction. His rage mounted as he stormed through the doors, pushing past the staff who watched him with a mixture of concern and judgment. Excuse me, sir, a young teller called hesitantly. Is there something I can help you with? Tom whirled around, his voice booming. No, you can't help me. I can't access my money. My account is frozen, and I don't know why. The teller took a step back, her eyes wide, and looked over at the manager who was already on the phone, speaking in low, measured tones. The manager caught Tom's eyes, his face unreadable. He knew exactly what had happened. The freeze order had gone through, and there was nothing they could do. But this was a bank. They weren't in the business of telling people that they had been outplayed. As Tom continued his tirade, his face growing darker with each passing minute, Ruth's voice drifted into Margaret's calm space. She had been watching the scene from the window, her smile wide with satisfaction. They were really good at putting on a show, aren't they? Ruth mused, her tone almost affectionate. But let them scream. It'll only make the silence you've built that much sweeter. Margaret didn't acknowledge Ruth's words at first, her attention still drawn to the birds outside. But when she did speak, her voice was calm, as though speaking through a veil. I've waited a long time for this moment, she said softly, and it's just beginning. Lily, standing in the doorway, watched her grandmother, her eyes wide. The depth of the calmness Margaret exuded unsettled her. Tom had always been the storm, loud, unpredictable, but momentary. Margaret, however, was the quiet aftermath, methodical, patient, inevitable. Later that afternoon, the quiet continued as it always did in Margaret's house. The birds had settled for the day, and the world outside seemed to move on. Indifferent to the drama unfolding within the family, Margaret's phone rang, the tone sharp in the silence. It was Mr. Harper. Margaret, he said when she answered, his voice steady. They'll retaliate soon. You need to be prepared. Margaret didn't respond immediately, but Ruth's voice, as if on cue, piped in through the open window. Let them, she said with a knowing grin. It'll be louder. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, the weight of the game settling in her chest. I've planned for that, she said, her voice soft but resolute. Let them try. In the next room, the unmistakable sound of clinking metal interrupted their conversation. Karen was at the pawn shop pawning off Margaret's silverware. Margaret, however, didn't flinch. This was just the beginning. The dull, metallic clang of silverware hitting the counter echoed through the house, sharp against the quiet that had settled like a thick fog. Karen had returned from the pawn shop with her hands empty but her face flushed with frustration. She had barely made it through the door before her eyes landed on the table, where Margaret sat, a pen poised in her hand, documenting the theft. The silverware, once a symbol of years spent together in celebration, was now gone. A family heirloom reduced to the cold, indifferent hands of a pawnshop dealer. And yet, Margaret's face betrayed nothing. She simply continued to write, her movements methodical, precise, each word a calculated response to the chaos her son and daughter-in-law had unleashed. Karen slammed the door behind her, the sound reverberating through the house. You're not going to let this go, are you? She spat, her voice dripping with venom. This is insane. You can't just write down everything I've done. Margaret looked up, her eyes piercing through the haze of anger and panic in Karen's voice. I'm not writing everything down, Margaret said coolly, her voice as calm as ever. I'm documenting what you've taken. Karen's lips quivered with the weight of the accusation, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel, her frustration growing like a wildfire. Tom was in the other room, and his rage was only building. Karen knew that if she didn't act fast, they would lose everything. The house had always been the one thing they thought would always be theirs, but now that was slipping away. Karen couldn't let that happen. Just as Margaret finished documenting the last item on the list, Tom stormed in, his face twisted with fury. He had been pacing the house for hours, his frustration growing with each failed attempt to access their bank accounts, and now he had nothing but more anger to release. "She's ruining us!" Tom screamed, his voice cracking with the weight of his helplessness. He slammed his fist against the kitchen counter, the impact shaking the glassware on the shelves. Lily, who had been standing quietly in the corner, lifted her phone and began recording. The screen lit up with the tension in the room, capturing Tom's meltdown in real time. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of pity for her mother and a strange sense of satisfaction. She had been waiting for this moment, watching her family slowly unravel, knowing that the truth would eventually come to light. Tom's voice, now hoarse with emotion, echoed through the kitchen. "You can't just take everything from us, Mom. What are we supposed to do now?" His hands balled into fists, but there was no one left to fight. Margaret simply watched him, unmoved. "Maybe you should try cooking on paper plates." Ruth's voice drifted in from the window, a wicked grin spreading across her face. She leaned in against the frame, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "It'll teach you a lesson in humility." Margaret remained silent, her gaze never leaving Tom. There was no need to explain. The lesson had already been set in motion. Every word he spoke only deepened the hole he and Karen had dug for themselves. The silence that followed was thick with tension, each passing second heavy with the weight of the past decisions now coming to a head. Margaret leaned back in her chair, placing her pen down with deliberate slowness. She finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "You've already lost, Tom," she said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "This isn't about money anymore. This is about something you'll never be able to get back." Lily's breath caught in her throat as she continued recording, her fingers steady despite the intensity of the moment. She couldn't tear her eyes away from her grandmother. It was as if Margaret had become something else, a force that couldn't be stopped. Tom's eyes narrowed, his frustration bubbling over into something darker. "What the hell are you talking about? You think you're going to ruin us with a few papers? You've frozen our accounts. You've taken our silver. But we can get it all back." Margaret didn't flinch. "No, Tom," she said quietly. "You won't get it back." And then, with the same calm precision she had displayed throughout the entire ordeal, Margaret picked up the phone and dialed the number for Mr. Harper. The line clicked, and his voice came through, calm and precise. "Margaret?" She didn't need to say much. The decision had already been made. "I've decided to freeze the inheritance trust as well," Margaret said, her voice firm. Tom's face went pale at the words. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His entire world was crumbling in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The cold realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The inheritance trust, the one thing that had always been out of reach, was now locked away from him forever. Major twist. The trust was no longer his. It was gone. Tom's gaze shifted to Margaret, his eyes wild with panic. You can't do this." His voice cracked, the weight of his words pressing in on him. "You don't understand what this will do to us. What will we have left?" Margaret, her expression as composed as ever, stood up slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. "What you'll have left, Tom," she said, her voice steady, "is nothing." The phone call had been short but final. Mr. Doyle, the bank manager, had heard the decision in Margaret's voice. The inheritance trust was locked now, a seal that would not be broken. It was done. The accounts were frozen, the lifeline that Tom and Karen had clung to, now just another unyielding barrier. Tom's breath came in shallow gasps, a panic rising in him that no amount of shouting could quell. He had tried everything, every possible angle to reach the trust's funds, to call in favors, to unfreeze the accounts. But the walls were up now. And it wasn't just the accounts. It was the trust. It was everything. By the time he stormed into the living room, his face pale and drawn with desperation, the first real wave of defeat was creeping over him. Karen, who had been pacing with her phone in hand, watched him as he crumpled onto the couch, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the news. Her lips trembled, and tears welled up, blurring her vision. "What do we do now, Tom?" Karen's voice was strained, a broken thread. "I don't—" She swallowed hard, unable to finish the thought. How could she? How could she do this? Tom didn't answer. His mind was elsewhere, a million thoughts colliding at once. The mortgage. What was he going to tell the bank? Their home was now in jeopardy, and all the plans they had made were crumbling. He had been counting on that trust for everything: the house, the luxury items, the sense of security they had built. Gone, wiped away in one swift stroke. The inheritance had been their escape, and now it was out of reach. Meanwhile, at the doctor's office, Margaret sat with serene composure, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she listened to the soft hum of fluorescent lights above. The doctor was speaking to her about her routine checkup, about her blood pressure, and the fact that everything was as it should be. But her mind was elsewhere, still immersed in the decision she had made. Her world was quieter now, a place where the consequences of her actions rippled outward, touching everything: Tom's rages, Karen's desperate cries, the loss that was now sitting heavy in the pit of their stomachs. She sat in that chair, perfectly still, untouched by the chaos she had set in motion. Lily sat beside her, her hand resting gently on her grandmother's. "Grandma, you just muted them," she said softly, watching Margaret's calm face as the world outside the examination room spun with fury. Margaret's eyes met Lily's for a moment, and she gave a faint, approving smile. "Sometimes," she said quietly, her voice carrying a wisdom that only years of silence could impart, "the most powerful thing you can do is let them talk, while you do nothing." Outside, the storm raged on. Tom's angry mutterings had become a low murmur in the background, the atmosphere thick with the weight of his frustration. Karen's sobs echoed faintly through the house, but neither of them could hear Margaret's calm. Ruth, who had been watching the scene unfold from the window of Margaret's house, couldn't contain her grin. She leaned her elbows against the frame and watched with relish as Tom paced, his movements erratic and wild. "Perfect volume," Ruth muttered to herself, taking a long drag from her cigarette. "Let them scream and shout. The silence they'll have to endure will be louder than anything they could say." It was a strange kind of justice, this silence. It wasn't about noise or the destruction of voices. It was about the quiet way Margaret had taken control, the calm authority with which she had cut through the chaos. Tom's fury, Karen's breakdowns, they were nothing but background noise to the life Margaret was now orchestrating, each move perfectly calculated. As Ruth's words hung in the air, Margaret placed the phone back on the receiver, its sharp click a reminder that there was no going back now. Her gaze remained steady, her focus sharp. She had always been patient, always played the long game, and now that game had entered its final phase. Lily squeezed Margaret's hand softly. "Are you okay, Grandma?" Margaret turned her gaze to Lily, her expression softening. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said, the weight of those words settling around them like a quiet storm. And as Ruth's voice faded into the background, the faintest of smiles played on Margaret's lips. She wasn't just taking everything from them, she was giving them something much worse, a lesson they would never forget. Tom's world had become a constant hum of failure, and it was getting louder with every passing minute. The mortgage payment was due, but there was no money to pay it. No trust, no assets, no escape. He'd already seen the empty accounts, had already felt the icy grip of reality tightening around his throat. And now the debt collectors had arrived, one by one, their footsteps echoing ominously down the hallway of his own home. It was like the final nail in the coffin. The first knock came around noon, just as Tom had made another attempt to dial the bank. Desperate, panicked, each failed call a reminder of how completely he'd misjudged his situation. The doorbell rang, and he froze, his fingers still clutching the receiver. He knew who it was, even before the knock sounded again. More insistent this time. He opened the door, and a man in a dark suit stood on the other side, his expression one of polite professionalism that only made Tom's stomach churn. The man held up a business card, his voice smooth but unwavering. "I'm with Anderson and Wells Collection Agency," he said. "I'm here to discuss the mortgage on your property." Tom's hand tightened into a fist, his knuckles white with the pressure. "I'm not," his voice faltered. "I'm not paying it right now. I don't have the money. The collector's gaze didn't waver. "You've been given ample time, Mr. Ellis. Now the matter is being escalated." He placed a small stack of papers in Tom's hand. "We're going to need a payment plan. Or we proceed with legal action." Tom's heart pounded in his chest, but his mouth went dry. There was no room left to bargain, no room left to fight. His eyes wandered to the pile of unopened bills scattered across the kitchen counter, the same ones he had hoped would just magically disappear. Now they were here, standing in front of him, all too real. The world that had once seemed so secure was now an abyss. Meanwhile, Margaret was calm, the kind of calm that seeped into your bones and held you still. She sat with Mr. Harper in his office, the paperwork between them now marked with the same indelible truth. The last thing they had talked about was the family's precarious financial situation, but Margaret hadn't flinched. Harper, watching her across the desk, spoke in a tone that was both grave and understanding. "They're not going to give up. Tom will fight this to the end. You're sure you're ready for the fallout?" Margaret looked up, her gaze sharp, steady, as though she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. "Let them fight," she said quietly. "They're already lost." Harper nodded. He knew the weight of the decisions Margaret had made. It wasn't just financial strategy, it was personal. It was the kind of cold, deliberate retribution that didn't require justification. Back at the house, Tom paced again. The debt collectors were just the beginning. He could feel the walls closing in. He had no answers, no way to stop this. And the phone continued to ring, each call a reminder of how far he had fallen. Lily, sitting quietly in the corner, watched her mother's desperation grow, but Margaret had not yet moved. She had not raised her voice, not even shifted in her seat. She had simply observed, as though waiting for the right moment to let everything unfold. "They'll drown fast," Lily murmured, her voice almost a whisper. Margaret looked at her, a smile flickering at the edges of her lips. "Yes," she said, her voice warm but cutting. "But it's not my job to save them." Lily's eyes softened, her heart heavy with the weight of her grandmother's words. They weren't just about Tom or Karen. They were about the consequences that always follow in the wake of entitlement, arrogance, and greed. Outside, Ruth leaned against the fence, her arms crossed, watching as Karen pulled out the last pieces of furniture from the house. The couch, the dining table, chairs. Everything was up for sale now. The same furniture they had once flaunted with pride was now nothing more than a commodity to be exchanged for something that might keep them afloat for a few more days, a few more hours. Ruth chuckled to herself, the sound dry but full of dark amusement. "Debt's a better teacher than parents," she muttered under her breath. "They'll learn soon enough." It wasn't just the possessions they had lost, it was everything. The luxury, the security, the illusion of control. All gone. Karen stumbled out the front door with the last of the furniture, her face pale and streaked with tears. "You should have listened," Ruth called out to her, her voice harsh but filled with a strange satisfaction. "Now you've got nothing left to sell." Margaret watched it all from the window, her face passive, but there was a glint in her eyes, A quiet, unspoken triumph. Everything had fallen into place. There was nothing more to say. The sound of the doorbell was unmistakable. It was a sharp, final ring that sliced through the tense silence of the house. Tom froze for a moment, his hand still gripping the crumpled bills in his fist. He had been pacing again, his frustration boiling over. But this time, he knew something was different. The feeling of inevitability hung in the air like the scent of an approaching storm. Karen, who had been sitting on the couch, her eyes swollen from crying, wiped her face hurriedly as she rushed to the door. Her hands trembled as she reached for the handle, but there was no escaping what awaited her outside. The sheriff stood there, his uniform neat and imposing against the backdrop of the sunlit driveway. He held out an envelope, his face cold and unreadable. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but businesslike. "This is a notice of eviction. You are to vacate the premises immediately." The words seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. For a moment Karen stood there, her mouth agape, as if she couldn't quite grasp the gravity of what was happening. Tom, hearing the words from inside, rushed toward the door, his voice rising in a mix of disbelief and rage. "Eviction? No!" Tom barked, his fists clenched. "You can't do this. This is my house." The sheriff remained unfazed, his gaze unwavering. "The bank's orders, sir," he said, handing Karen the paperwork. "It's out of my hands now." The paper shook in Karen's hands as she read the eviction notice, her tears now spilling uncontrollably. Her sobs racked her body, but the sheriff didn't flinch, offering nothing more than a curt nod before turning to leave. As the door closed behind him, the reality of the moment settled in. Tom and Karen stood in silence, the weight of everything that had crumbled around them bearing down in suffocating waves. Karen collapsed to the couch, her hands gripping the paper like a lifeline. "What now, Tom?" she cried, her voice broken. "Where do we go? We've lost everything. How are we supposed to start over?" Tom could only stare at the notice, his mind spinning with anger and helplessness. The house, the life they had built, was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In the kitchen, the scent of fresh bread wafted through the air, the golden crusts rising steadily in the oven. Margaret stood at the counter, her hands steady as she kneaded the dough, her movements calm, precise, unaffected by the chaos outside. She had been preparing this meal for hours, a quiet reflection of the stillness that had become her life. Each motion was deliberate, each breath measured as she worked. Lily sat nearby, watching her grandmother with a quiet reverence. The contrast between the storm raging in the other room and Margaret's serenity was striking. There was no panic, no sense of urgency in Margaret's movements. She worked as if the world outside didn't matter at all, as if the only thing that mattered was the calm rhythm of the task at hand. Lily's eyes softened as she watched her grandmother. "Grandma," she said quietly, "how do you stay so calm?" Margaret looked up for a moment, her eyes meeting Lily's with a quiet strength. "It's the quiet moments that count, Lily," she said, her voice soft but firm. "When everything else is falling apart, you find peace where you can." Outside, Ruth leaned against the fence, her eyes glinting with amusement as she observed the spectacle from a distance. "Warm kitchen beats cold streets, doesn't it?" she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. Margaret didn't respond, but the slight smile on her face told Ruth everything she needed to know. The pieces were falling into place. Karen and Tom were learning the hardest lesson of all, and Margaret had given them exactly what they deserved. Lily stood up, moving over to Margaret and wrapping her arms around her in a quiet embrace. "I'm glad you're here," Lily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're the only one who's not losing it." Margaret held Lily tightly, her heart steady as ever. "We don't lose what we don't let go of, sweetheart," she murmured. "And I'm not letting go of what's mine." As the two stood there in the warm kitchen, the weight of everything that had happened settling around them, they could hear the sounds of Tom and Karen in the other room, their voices rising in anger, their world crashing down around them. But inside the kitchen, the bread was baking. The world outside could do as it pleased, and Margaret Ellis was finally at peace. The house, once the epicenter of Tom and Karen's false sense of security, now belonged to Margaret. The papers had been signed, the deal done. Mr. Harper had filed the deed quietly, without fanfare or ceremony, just as he had done with everything else. To him, it was business. To Margaret, it was a lesson years in the making. But to Tom and Karen, it was a cruel joke they hadn't yet realized. Margaret stood in the entryway, her eyes tracing the familiar contours of the house. The walls still held the remnants of their past, a mix of fleeting moments, laughter, and triumphs long gone. The furniture, once arranged with pride, sat untouched, awaiting the final chapter of their story. Margaret's fingers lingered over the banister, the weight of the house no longer just a place to live, but a symbol of the quiet power she had claimed. "Don't think they know yet," Ruth's voice broke through the silence, sharp with amusement. She had been watching from across the street, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "They still think they've got time." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The storm outside had already begun, and there was no turning back now. Tom and Karen still didn't know that the house was no longer theirs, that every single thing they had once taken for granted was now under her control. They were still out there, grappling with the fallout from the eviction notice, unaware that the ground had already shifted beneath them. Inside the house, Margaret moved with a quiet precision, her steps slow and measured. She didn't rush. There was no need. The furniture that Tom and Karen had so proudly displayed, the couches, the dining room chairs, and even the grand piano in the living room, all of it would stay. But not in the way they had imagined. Lily stood in the doorway, watching her grandmother as she surveyed the room. "Grandma," she said, her voice low, "you turned silence into thunder." Margaret smiled faintly, but there was no real joy in it. The thunder had already come and gone. It had made its mark. Now was the calm after the storm, the settling of the dust. "Sometimes," she said softly, her eyes glinting with a quiet ferocity, "it's not about making noise. It's about letting them think they've won before the real lesson begins." Lily, standing behind her, watched as her grandmother moved toward the kitchen, her gaze fixed on the same objects Tom and Karen had once cherished. She could feel the weight of it all, the life they had tried to build now slipping through their fingers like sand. As the hours passed, Ruth's laughter echoed through the empty street. She had been right about one thing. Tom and Karen still hadn't realized that Margaret had taken everything. They thought it was just the eviction. They thought that was the worst of it. But Margaret had played the long game. The sound of the front door creaked open, and soon after, Tom and Karen walked in, their faces still flushed from the earlier confrontation with the sheriff. They had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Their voices carried through the house, muffled but frantic. Tom slammed the door behind him, his fists clenched. "Where's the money, Karen?" he demanded, his frustration bubbling over. "We've got nothing left." "Nothing." Karen's eyes were still red from crying. "We'll figure it out, Tom. We always do." But even she knew her words were hollow. There was no figuring this out. The house, their sanctuary, had been ripped from their grasp. It was only when they walked into the living room that they saw it. Margaret, sitting on the couch, watching them with a calmness that made their stomachs drop. "Mom." Tom's voice was shaky, but it carried a tremor of fear. "What are you doing here? Margaret stood up slowly, the movement deliberate, and in one smooth motion she handed them the papers. "It's my house now," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. Tom and Karen stood frozen, staring at the documents in their hands. The deed. The ownership had shifted. The ground beneath them had crumbled. "But how?" Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. She couldn't comprehend it. This was the last thing they expected. It wasn't just eviction, it was betrayal. Something deeper, colder than anything they had prepared for. Margaret took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering as she spoke the words that sealed their fate. "I'm not selling," she said with quiet finality. I'm renting it back to you. At triple the rate you were paying before. Tom's face turned crimson, his eyes wild with a mix of disbelief and fury. You can't. This isn't legal, he shouted, but even as he said it, he knew it didn't matter. He had lost. Karen's face fell, and her breath hitched in her throat. This was the ultimate betrayal, the kind of cruel poetic justice that left them with nothing but their pride, and even that was slipping away. Margaret smiled faintly. You'll pay, and you'll stay, and every month, you'll remember this lesson. The sound of the front door closing behind Tom and Karen reverberated through the house, as though the weight of their past choices had finally caught up with them. They stood in the hallway, the reality of what had just happened settling in, their eyes flickering nervously toward Margaret. She was still, like a rock in the middle of a storm, her gaze unyielding, her calm demeanor as sharp as ever. The house, their house, was no longer theirs. And now they stood on the edge of something much worse. Karen glanced at the papers in her hands, the lease agreement that Margaret had written up, with her own name boldly marked as the landlord. Tom's fists clenched, his jaw tight with rage, but there was nothing left to say, no fight left to give. They had no choice but to sign. How much? Tom asked, his voice low and barely controlled. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone now, replaced by the quiet despair of a man who had lost everything. Margaret's voice was steady as she spoke, the words slipping out like ice. Triple the amount you were paying before, she said, her tone as unwavering as the signature she would soon add to the bottom of the lease. Karen's face twisted, her lips trembling as she glanced over the terms. This wasn't just about the money, it was about power, about control, about every ounce of pride being stripped away with each word they read. This was their punishment. Are you serious? Karen whispered, her voice breaking. Her eyes shot to Tom, but he only shrugged, a hollow gesture. They both knew the truth now. There was no getting out of this. Lily stood off to the side, her phone steady in her hands as she filmed the scene unfolding in front of her. There was no emotion on her face, no judgment. She had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than any word, and this moment was too important to waste. She watched her grandmother calmly take the pen and sign her name at the bottom of the lease, her handwriting as crisp and precise as always. Karen watched Margaret sign, her breath shallow, her pride slipping further with each stroke of the pen. She stood beside Tom, her fingers trembling, but she was too humiliated to even argue. She had no leverage left. Nothing. Not even the security of her own home. Lily caught the moment on her phone, her heart racing a little faster than normal. The sense of power in the room was palpable, the kind that could only come from an irreversible shift in the balance of control. Margaret slid the lease toward Tom and Karen. Sign, she said, her voice quiet but absolute. Tom hesitated. His pride, his last shred of dignity, was fighting to stay intact, but he could feel the weight of the situation crushing him. He knew he had lost. They both did. With a sharp exhale, he snatched the pen and signed the lease, his movements jerky, defeated. Karen followed suit, her face pale as she scribbled her name. The act felt like a death sentence, each letter a final confirmation of how completely they had been bested. Once the papers were signed, Margaret stood up, her posture dignified, almost regal. She placed the lease on the counter with deliberate care, each action as final as the words that had passed between them. You'll pay at the end of every month, same day, no exceptions. Karen looked down at the papers again, her breath catching in her chest. You don't understand, Margaret, she whispered, the anger rising in her throat. We have nothing left. How are we supposed to survive this? Margaret turned away, her voice almost gentle, yet laced with the finality of someone who had made her decision long ago. That's not my problem anymore. Ruth's voice drifted in from the open window, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. Louder than eviction, she muttered with a sharp grin. She raised a glass, though they couldn't see her, and her words floated across the yard. louder than eviction. Inside, the weight of Ruth's words hung heavy in the air. The humiliation of being forced to sign a lease in the home they had once owned, the very place they had thought they could claim as their own forever, was a lesson in itself. Tom stood motionless, his face flushed with anger, but it was a hollow rage. The battle was over. He had been beaten not by force but by the quiet, unyielding determination of his mother. "Your pride's been broken," Margaret said, almost as an afterthought, her eyes scanning the room, now filled with the pieces of what used to be their life. "But it's not over. Not yet. I want you both to understand that this is only the beginning." Lily looked up from her phone, her eyes meeting her grandmother's. "Are you really going to make them pay, Grandma?" Margaret's eyes softened, but only slightly. "It's not about the money," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's about the lesson they'll carry with them every single day." The silence that followed was thick, filled with the unspoken truths of the moment. Outside, Ruth's laughter rang out once more, an echo of something dark and satisfying. The kitchen was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the rhythmic sound of Margaret's spoon stirring the coffee in her cup. She sat at the table, unmoving, her eyes fixed on the surface, deep in thought. The morning light streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the room, but there was no warmth in the air, only the cold satisfaction of a battle well fought. Lily entered quietly, her phone in hand. She had been silent all morning, her heart heavy with the weight of the video she'd been holding on to. She had caught more than just the humbling of Tom and Karen. She'd captured their shame, their lies, and the betrayal they had tried so desperately to keep hidden. Lily didn't sit down immediately. She stood at the threshold of the kitchen, her fingers gripping the phone as though it were an anchor. The video had been recorded in secret, as Tom's anger had flared up again that morning when he had let his guard down. The video was raw. Tom's words, Karen's reactions, and the final moment of truth. Margaret looked up from her coffee, meeting her granddaughter's gaze. There was no need for words. They both knew what Lily was holding. Margaret raised an eyebrow, her voice calm and steady. "Let me see it," she said quietly. Lily nodded and stepped forward, showing her grandmother the video. The footage played in silence between them, and Margaret watched intently as Tom raged about how nothing had gone according to plan, how Karen had humiliated them both, and the darkest secret of all, his affair. The video was grainy, but the words were clear. Tom had been speaking to Karen, and in his anger, he'd confessed everything. How he'd been unfaithful, how the betrayal had been going on for months, and how he'd blamed her for everything falling apart. As the video ended, Lily looked up at her grandmother. "What now, Grandma?" Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee, her expression unchanged. "Now," she said softly, "we let them feel the weight of their action." Outside the kitchen window, Ruth's voice drifted in, her words tinged with something dark, something almost sweet. "Even betrayal echoes," she murmured, though her words were meant for no one but herself. Margaret smiled faintly, acknowledging Ruth's presence without turning to look. Ruth had always known what was coming. She had seen the quiet fire in Margaret's eyes, the fire that burned so slowly it was almost imperceptible until it consumed everything in its path. Inside the house, Tom's emotional collapse was as inevitable as the dawn. He had watched the video himself, and now the full weight of his own lies pressed in on him. He staggered into the living room, his face pale, his hands shaking. It was as though he had aged 10 years in an instant. Tom sank to his knees in front of Margaret, his voice cracking with desperation. "Mom, please. I didn't mean it. I made a mistake." His hands reached out, trembling. Karen. Karen doesn't know. She doesn't know what I did." Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't move a muscle. Her calm was unwavering, and she allowed him to fall apart before her without offering a single word of comfort. This was a moment of reckoning, and it wasn't hers to control. Tom had built his own prison, and now he had to sit in it. Karen's reaction, however, was something else entirely. Her fury had been building all morning, but now, with the weight of the affair laid bare, she couldn't hold it in any longer. She stormed into the room, her face a mask of rage and humiliation. Her hands shook as she screamed, her voice rising with each passing second. "You did this to us, Tom," she shrieked. "You lied. You betrayed me. And now look at where we are. Look at what we've lost. I I can't." Karen's words became a blur as she began pacing wildly, her face flushed with frustration. But in a moment of pure spite, she turned on her heel and marched out the front door, slamming it behind her with a force that rattled the walls. Her departure was loud, but somehow it felt like the last breath of a dying battle. Margaret remained at the table, her hands steady as she sipped her coffee, her calmness like a storm contained. Lily, standing silently behind her, had witnessed it all. She felt a pang of sadness for her mother and uncle, but she couldn't help but understand the lesson Margaret had been teaching. "Are you going to do something about this, Grandma?" Lily asked, her voice filled with quiet awe. Margaret placed her cup down gently and stood up, her movements deliberate and slow. "They've had their chance," she said, her eyes soft but resolute. "Now it's time for them to understand what real consequences look like." Her voice was firm, unwavering. There was no fear left, no hesitation. She had made her decision long ago, and now, with everything in place, it was time to finish what she had started. Tom's world had collapsed in slow motion, each piece of it crumbling in the aftermath of his own making. The mortgage was unpaid. The bank was breathing down his neck. His name had been erased from the deeds, the house no longer his. What had once been a symbol of success was now just an empty shell, a physical reminder of everything he had lost. He sat alone in the barren living room of his former home, the walls now echoing with the silence of defeat. There was no furniture, no signs of the life he and Karen had once lived here. The space was hollow, the air thick with the weight of what had been stripped away. Tom's phone lay forgotten on the coffee table, the calls from creditors and banks going unanswered. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair disheveled, and his hands trembled with the cold realization that everything was gone. Not just the house, but the trust, the family, the comfort that had once been his. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow over the streets. But inside, it was like the last light had gone out of his life. Every decision, every lie, every betrayal had brought him to this moment, and there was no one left to blame but himself. In the kitchen, Margaret was steady, as always. She moved with purpose, her every action measured and calm, unaffected by the storm swirling outside. The kettle whistled softly as she poured herself another cup of tea, her fingers wrapped around the warm porcelain, the steam rising in the cool air. Lily entered the kitchen quietly, her expression a mix of sadness and understanding. She had watched it all unfold, the unraveling of her family, the slow collapse of everything Tom and Karen had worked for. But her grandmother? She remained unshaken, untouched by the chaos. "Grandma," Lily said softly, her voice still raw from the events of the past few days, "you won." Margaret's gaze shifted toward her, her eyes sharp but filled with quiet approval. "No, Lily," she replied, her voice soft yet firm. "They lost." Lily nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what it had taken to get here. Tom had lost, but so much had been sacrificed along the way. She wasn't sure if the victory was worth the cost. From outside, Ruth's voice floated in through the open window. "Volume 0, she muttered, as though it were some kind of dark triumph, her words lingering in the evening air like smoke. Margaret smiled faintly, a hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "Let them scream all they want," she said quietly. "In the end, it's silence that speaks loudest." Lily looked out the window, her mind racing through the events of the past few weeks. She had been a witness to everything, the cruelty, the betrayal, the manipulation. And now, as the final chapter of this story was written, she couldn't help but wonder what would become of her family. What would Tom do now? What would Karen do? They had nothing left. And even worse, they had no way to rebuild. She turned to Margaret. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "They're broken. There's nothing left for them." Margaret's face softened, but only slightly. She set her teacup down with deliberate care, and then reached for a folder sitting on the counter. It was filled with papers, documents that had been carefully arranged, each one a small but deliberate piece in the puzzle Margaret had crafted over the years. "This is where the next phase begins," Margaret said, handing the folder to Lily. Lily opened the folder, her eyes scanning the papers inside. It was a new will, an updated version, no longer containing Tom's name. It was the final step in severing the ties, the final action in a plan that had been years in the making. Margaret spoke again, her voice steady and unwavering. "I've updated the will. Tom's been cut from everything." Lily's eyes widened in shock, but there was no anger in Margaret's voice, only a quiet resolve. "You can't do that," Lily whispered, her heart heavy with the finality of it all. "He's still your son." Margaret met her gaze, her eyes filled with something colder now, something beyond regret, beyond sorrow. "He forfeited everything when he chose to destroy this family." The weight of the words settled between them, and Lily could feel the finality of the decision. Tom was no longer a part of the legacy Margaret had built. He had broken the trust, betrayed the family, and now he was left with nothing. There was a knock at the door. Lily hesitated, her fingers still lingering over the papers. She glanced at Margaret, but her grandmother simply nodded. The same calm composure that had carried her through the storm. Lily opened the door, and standing in the doorway was Mr. Harper, his expression neutral as always. He stepped inside, holding an envelope in his hand. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of what was about to be delivered. "The divorce asset freeze has been finalized." Margaret nodded, her gaze steady. "It's done then," she said quietly, her lips curving into a small, satisfied smile. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the kitchen, its warm light spilling onto the counter where Margaret sat, steady and unmoving. She had always been a woman of measured actions, but today the air around her seemed even stiller than usual. The final will had been prepared, the final decision had been made. Lily sat across from her, the same quiet intensity in her eyes, as she watched her grandmother sign the last of the document. Margaret's pen glided smoothly across the paper, each stroke deliberate, purposeful. The weight of the action was palpable, as if every inch of the page was a declaration of intent, a symbol of the years of patience that had led to this moment. The will was clear. Tom had been erased. The legacy that Margaret had spent her life building, her home, her trust, everything, would now go to Sophie, her granddaughter. There was no longer any place for Tom in this story. His betrayal had sealed his fate. Margaret placed the pen down, her fingers lingering on the paper for a moment longer than necessary. Her eyes flickered briefly to Lily and then back to the document. She wasn't looking for approval. This had never been about that. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the power was hers to wield. This was her choice, her legacy, her right to decide who would carry it forward. "You know, Sophie will do right by this," Margaret said quietly, her voice full of certainty. Lily nodded, but the heaviness of the moment hung between them. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about the power that came with it. The power to strip away what others had taken for granted, to tear down what had been built on lies. The very power that Margaret had reclaimed. Outside, Ruth's voice floated in. As always, a little too sharp, a little too pleased. "Legacy's louder than laughter," she called, her voice laced with satisfaction. She was watching from her usual perch, where she always seemed to be a silent observer of the collapse, the aftermath of Margaret's decisions. Margaret allowed herself a small smile, her gaze steady. "She's right," Margaret said quietly, her eyes never leaving the will. They thought they could laugh it off, but in the end, it's the silence that echoes. Lily stood, her eyes lingering on the paper in front of her, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. But she couldn't deny that there was something undeniably strong in Margaret's calm resolve. It was like the final chapter of a long and difficult story had been written. Tom had lost, and there was no going back. The doorbell rang, breaking the quiet tension that had settled in the room. Lily hesitated, her hand still hovering over the will. Margaret didn't react, as though this moment, too, was inevitable. She stood and walked calmly to the door, the sound of her footsteps punctuating the silence. When Lily opened it, Mr. Harper stood there, his face as neutral as always. He stepped inside, holding a thick envelope in his hand, and walked over to the kitchen table where Margaret was seated. "The will is complete," Harper said, his voice carrying the quiet weight of the legal proceedings. He set the envelope down carefully in front of Margaret. "It's notarized. Everything's in order." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, her eyes unwavering. She nodded. "Good," she said simply, her voice steady. There was no need for more words. It was done. She opened the envelope slowly, scanning the final paperwork. The condo trust was locked in, all decisions finalized. Margaret had already set things in motion. The financial machinery was in place. Sophie would inherit everything, including the trust, the home, and everything tied to it. But as Margaret read the last page, something inside her shifted. There was more than just the inheritance to think about. Lily looked over her shoulder, a quiet curiosity in her gaze. "Grandma? What's that?" Margaret's fingers paused as she looked up, the faintest of smiles playing at the corner of her lips. "Something I've been meaning to do for a long time." She reached for the pen again, her hand steady as she signed the last page with a flourish. The document was now official. The rental profits from the house would be donated to a hearing aid charity. Lily's eyes widened in surprise. "You're giving it all away?" she asked, her voice a mix of admiration and disbelief. Margaret nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at her granddaughter. "Sometimes, the real power isn't in what you keep, but in what you choose to give away." Harper stood back, watching the exchange in silence. He had seen Margaret's cold determination, her ruthless efficiency. But this? This was something different. "You've done it again, Margaret," Harper said, his voice betraying a note of genuine respect. "It's all set." Margaret stood slowly, her expression serene but sharp. She walked to the window, gazing out at the street below. The house that had once been the center of everything for Tom and Karen was now truly hers. They had lost it all, and in doing so, they had given her the last piece of the puzzle. "I've played the long game," Margaret said, her voice low. "And in the end, the silence is louder than the noise they make." The sun had barely risen, casting a soft light over the city as Margaret sat at her kitchen table, quietly sipping her morning tea. The house, once a symbol of loss and betrayal, had transformed into something new. It was now a place of quiet triumph, a reflection of Margaret's patience and the final result of years of planning. A local reporter's voice floated up through the window from the street below, his words eager and filled with admiration. The small charity Margaret had created to donate the house's rental profits to a hearing aid fund was making headlines. Local philanthropist Margaret Ellis has set a new precedent, using her family's misfortune to help others in need, the reporter said, unaware of the irony in his words. Inside, Margaret's gaze remained steady, her hands folded neatly on the table. This was her legacy, this quiet, deliberate giving. She had taken what was once a tool for revenge and transformed it into something far greater, a gift that would outlast the bitterness that had once poisoned everything. Lily entered the kitchen, her face bright with pride. It had been only days since the news had broken, but already the public response was overwhelming. The charity had drawn widespread praise, and as the press rallied around Margaret's unexpected generosity, Lily could see the weight of it lifting from her grandmother's shoulders. "You're making a real difference, Grandma," Lily said, her voice full of admiration. The press. Everyone's talking about it. They're calling it a real legacy. Margaret smiled faintly, but her expression remained calm, unshaken by the attention. I've simply taken what was already mine, Lily, she replied softly. This house was built on sacrifices. Now it can build something good. She glanced over at the framed photograph of Sophie, who had just been appointed trustee of the fund, ensuring that the profits from the rental would go to those who needed it most. Sophie's smile, wide and genuine, had become a symbol of the future Margaret was determined to create. Ruth's voice, sharp and full of pride, came from the doorway. I always knew you had it in you, she said with a grin. She leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. You've done more than just shut them down, Margaret. You've built something lasting. Margaret's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. She knew Ruth was proud, but she didn't need to say it aloud. The moment was enough. The power had shifted, not just within her family, but within the world around her. Tom and Karen might have thought they could take everything, but they had only given her more. Now, she was the one shaping the future. And what of them? Ruth asked, her voice low. Tom? Karen? Margaret didn't flinch, didn't look up from her tea. They're forgotten, she said simply, her tone quiet but final. They've become a footnote in my story. Outside, the reporters continued to shout questions, their voices now almost drowned out by the hum of the city. For a moment, Margaret allowed herself to close her eyes, to savor the calm before the storm. It was over. A small knock interrupted the quiet. Lily answered it, finding the local press standing at the door, eager to speak to Margaret about the recent developments. But as they entered, she could sense the shift in energy. These were not the same reporters who had once stood on the sidelines, questioning her every move. They were now eager to learn from her, to understand the quiet force that had reshaped her life and her family's. I'm sorry, the lead reporter said, but we need a few more details for the story. Would you like to give a statement about your family's role in this? About the legacy you've built? Margaret sat back, her posture still elegant, unbothered by the attention. Her eyes gleamed with quiet wisdom. I've said everything I need to say, she replied smoothly. The legacy isn't about them. It's about what you leave behind when it's all said and done. The reporter hesitated, clearly moved, but Margaret had already dismissed him with a soft wave of her hand. There was nothing left for her to explain. The story had already been written. As the reporters left, Ruth raised her glass in silent recognition, her eyes gleaming with something akin to respect. Legacy, she murmured, louder than laughter. Lily stood by the window, gazing out at the street below. The legacy had indeed become louder than any of the chaos that had preceded it. It wasn't in the revenge, or the eviction, or even the fortune left behind. It was in the quiet strength of a woman who had faced down betrayal and turned it into something that could help the world. Margaret's smile was small but meaningful as she looked up at her granddaughter. Now that's sound money, she said softly. The sun had nearly set, its orange and pink hues painting the sky as Margaret, Lily, and Ruth sat quietly on the porch. The hum of the city had softened, replaced by the peaceful chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. For the first time in weeks, there was a deep stillness in the air, as though the world had paused to reflect alongside them. Margaret sat in her favorite rocking chair, a blanket draped across her lap. The soft creak of the chair was the only sound that broke the quiet, a rhythmic reminder of the years that had passed, the years that had shaped her into the woman who now sat at peace. Beside her, Lily sat on the steps, her head resting gently on her grandmother's shoulder, her eyes half closed in contentment. Ruth, leaning against the railing, surveyed the scene with a satisfied grin, her eyes glinting with a mixture of pride and mischief. The hearing aid had been restored. Margaret's hearing aid, the one that had been mocked so cruelly by Tom and Karen. It had come full circle. The once laughable relic had been repaired and upgraded, a symbol of resilience and wisdom in a world that often preferred to ignore the quiet strength of the unseen. Lily turned toward her grandmother, her voice barely above a whisper. It's all come together, hasn't it? Margaret's eyes softened as she looked at her granddaughter. Sometimes, Lily, things have to fall apart before they can be put back together. The sound of the front door closing gently echoed from inside the house, as Karen's departure and Tom's lingering absence had made room for something else, something that had always been there but had been drowned out by their chaos. Peace. Margaret lifted the small box containing the newly restored hearing aid, holding it between her fingers. She glanced at the evening sky, letting the silence of the moment settle around them. This hearing aid, she said softly, wasn't just for hearing. Ruth chuckled from her spot against the railing, arms crossed and an almost predatory grin on her face. Oh, I know. You heard everything, didn't you, Margaret? Even when they thought they could sell it as a joke? Margaret's lips curled upward, a faint smile of acknowledgement. I heard everything, she murmured. Even when they tried to make a joke out of me, I heard them. The silence spoke louder. Lily, sitting up straighter, looked at her grandmother with wide eyes. You've always been so calm. How did you do it? How did you stay so patient when they— Her voice trailed off, the question unspoken but understood. Margaret sighed softly, the weight of the past and the present both heavy on her heart. Betrayal can be loud, but patience is quiet. And justice? Justice is louder than any of it. She placed the hearing aid in her ear, a small but powerful gesture that completed the circle of everything she had endured and overcome. The world around her came into sharper focus, the sounds of the evening, the voices of the people she loved, the world she had worked so hard to protect and rebuild. Ruth smirked, her eyes gleaming with something that only she understood. And you heard everything, she said, her tone filled with dark amusement. Margaret smiled softly, her gaze turning inward as she reflected on everything that had led her here. Betrayal, patience, and justice. The trifecta that had built her quiet victory. And as the sunset bathed the world in golden light, Margaret knew that the story had already been told. She had listened closely when they mocked her. She had waited patiently when they thought she was defeated. And now, with the world at her feet, she could hear the last note of the symphony she had composed, a note that carried the weight of everything she had endured and, in the end, had overcome. They sold my hearing aid as a joke, but I listened closely. When the bank froze their accounts,